A scar is a fibrous tissue that replaces normal skin after an injury. Scars are a biological result, a process of wound repair in the skin, organs, tissue, all sorts of parts of the body. Scars are a natural part of the healing process, and were we unable to make scars, we would be in much worse shape. Open, gaping wounds, possibility of infections. Scars are proof of the natural healing process. They are memories of pain that we've had and reminders of the healing that we have endured. They come from all sorts of things: accidents, diseases, surgeries. And let me tell you something. I know about scars. I have got scars all over me. In fact, by the time I graduated high school, I estimated that I had already had 200 stitches in my body without ever having a single surgery. Sporting accidents, accidents with animals, dog bites, falling, tripping, running into things, not paying attention. I once had an emotional experience driving by a childhood hospital that I lived near. I spent a lot of time in the emergency room as a child. And I've spent a lot of time looking at new wounds and thinking to myself, oh, well, I hope that heals up and I don't have to look at that again. Lots and lots and lots of scars. My poor mom spent a lot of time trying to get me to heal from scars. I've had scars that were intentional, surgeries planned, wondering how that was going to heal. I've had accidents that have been made into scars. I even have scars that I created for just being an idiot. Like when I was a child and had chicken pox, it wouldn't stop scratching myself with my sister's hairbrush. Scars come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Sometimes they come in ways that we never could have imagined or prepared ourselves for. My wife has a terrible scar around her ankle right about here that she got because she was trying to untangle our dog, and the dog saw something and took off, and the wire rope that keeps her got her and burned her around it, and it never quite properly healed. Scars come from all sorts of reasons, and we don't always know when they're going to come. We don't always wake up expecting them. Sometimes life happens, and there's pain, and then there's long memory on our body of that pain. But there are scars that are emotional as well, and that's really what we're getting at as we're talking about this series this month, Dancing with the Scars. We are talking about trying to live a life that is fully Christian, that's identifying and recognizing and spending time and living with the things that have caused us pain or been part of telling our story or things that we struggle with. For those of you who understand or can imagine what we're talking about in terms of scars, who know the emotional pain and struggle and toil of life, you know that sometimes these scars make themselves known in times that you weren't expecting. Some days, like anniversaries, you know are going to be difficult if you've lost someone in the past. Or if you run into someone who has hurt you and it's both on the calendar and you know you're going to be there, you prepare yourself for hurt. But sometimes hurt comes in very unexpected ways, things that trigger memories or pains that you weren't expecting. And spending time dancing with those scars is really the last thing that you want to do. My hope is this month, as we talk about different issues and ways that we can hurt, as we talk about what it is that Jesus does to bring us healing, my hope is that it becomes redemptive to you, that we develop new tools and categories to think through the things that bring us pain, that lead us towards a redemption and a hope, and a healthy way of thinking about the things that have scarred us in our life. And so today we're going to talk about death and dying and grieving. For as many people as there are in this room, there are more than one-to-one of people that we've lost, that we've known. Death is a part of life, and grieving is a necessary process that comes out of it. And so today I just want to face that head on if we can, and talk about the scars that our loved ones have left by dying, whether from accident or natural causes or old age or surprise. Every death brings about a hole in our life and a pain, and we must go through a process of grieving. The way we talk about death in our society is quite often problematic. It quite often doesn't help us lead towards healing. And so I want to talk about some of those things today and hopefully come up with some more helpful categories to think through. One of the most obvious ways that we talk about death in our society is ghosts. There's lots of ways that ghosts are talking about in our society. And there's all sorts of conversation about whether or not ghosts are real and what they are, and do we know them or are they haunting? People talk about ghosts a lot, and there's always, like if it comes up in a serious place, people want to argue about whether they're real or not. Now, everything that I know about ghosts, every last thing that I know about ghosts, I learned from one place and one place only. Scooby-Doo. I watched Scooby-Doo all the time as a kid, and that story had a very, very particular way of telling the story about ghosts. Someone who is evil and had a curly mustache was utilizing the illusion of the supernatural to frighten you away so that they could become rich or powerful. And always Scooby and those pesky kids get in the way of them achieving their goals. People prey on the fears of other humans in order to take something. This really shaped my understanding of ghosts. I'm not like a believe in ghosts kind of a guy because I watched Scooby-Doo. I know there's always a man under the hood, right? But there are other people who really believe in ghosts. In fact, some people might even be in this room today. But there are some weird things that are unexplainable. Even though I'm not a big ghosts person, some really deeply unusual things. Like, for example, did you know that the FBI has experts in the paranormal? This is a job. And they send them out to famous American landmarks where famous events happen to determine whether or not there is a haunting of the past. A great local example is Gettysburg. Gettysburg is understood by many people to be haunted and hallowed grounds, where the FBI regularly sends paranormal experts there to find out what is happening in terms of ghosts on that battlefield where thousands of men 150 years ago died in a bloody battle in the Civil War. There are experts who go and study this. Did you know, for example, that not only Gettysburg, but another close thing is that it's believed that the White House in D.C. is haunted? Have you heard this before? It's believed that it's haunted by, get this, Abraham Lincoln. It's true. You can look this up. And before, I just toss this out, I'm inclined to toss all this stuff out. But as I was reading about it this week, listen to these names of people who claim that they have run into Abraham Lincoln in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower's press secretary, Lady Bird Johnson, Margaret Truman, Grace Coolidge. Those are president names, man. Those are American names. I want to say those aren't wackadoodles, but I've watched the news. You never really know. But check this one out. This is my famous story of a person you know who says they've run into Lincoln. Winston Churchill was visiting the United States of America and staying in the White House. As he was wont to do, he would finish his day of meetings and retire to his place of staying and take a long bath. Upon taking a bath, he would emerge from the bath, dry himself off, and light a cigar. And on this particular day, he lit a cigar and walked into the bedroom adjacent to the bathroom he was in. And he found Abraham Lincoln in the room he was staying in. And Winston Churchill, telling the story as only Winston Churchill could, said that he said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." I would say so. In 1942, the Queen of the Netherlands came and stayed at the White House. 1942. Stayed at the White House when she heard a knock at her door. She got up and walked to the door, opened the door, and says that Abraham Lincoln was standing on the other side of the door, waiting for her. These are strange stories. I don't ever know what to do with them. But people who do study ghosts, who believe in ghosts, who go and study paranormal activity and become experts and write in it, they say that ghosts are not like Scooby-Doo, that when they line people up who give testimonies of having seen the paranormal, their responses that are always common is that ghosts don't want to scare you, they want to be seen. This is what the testimonies of people, this is what lines up. That ghosts aren't meant to scare you. Ghosts are meant to be seen. That their memories are remembered. That their stories are heard. That they are recognized for who they were and what they've been. Think of Lincoln, for example, right? The story we tell ourselves about Abraham Lincoln is that he gave his life saving the union of our country. That's a high price to pay. And so you could see why people would see him and remember him and think of that in haunted sort of terms. I don't ever know what to do with ghosts, but I do know that there's a whole segment of people that love the idea of ghosts. So much so that when I was a child, my mom warned me with like finger wagging in my face and those like mom eyes when you know she's being serious, that I was to never mess with any of this paranormal stuff. No Ouija boards, no Bloody Marys, no seances, none of that stuff is going to be permissible in our house. And so I was properly scared by my mom when she would get in these places. And so I've never messed with this stuff, and I have no interest in doing so. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 18 really does go to great lengths to warn us about the sort of seeking of the spiritual beyond what we can see, practices of occult, seance, that sort of thing. Deuteronomy 18, if you wanted to check it out, is pretty clear that we should not be messing with that stuff. But I have to admit, the most generous way that I can think about this is that I understand why someone who is in grief would want to do that. I can understand how someone who lost someone that they loved would want to have just one more experience with the person they spent their life loving. To hear their voice one more time, to know that they're okay on the other side. I can understand the temptation to do that. I spent a lot of time this week thinking about what kind of a person I would be if one of my daughters died. And the pain that wells up just in the hypothetical causes me to understand why it is people want to know. In fact, I can recall that when my dad died about 15 years ago, that the time my mom called me crying the hardest, and listen, when grief is active and recent, there are crying phone calls, am I right? The time she was crying the hardest, she was inconsolable, indeterminable. It was so hard to figure out why it was that she was blubbering so much, and I couldn't understand what she was saying until I finally made out that she had accidentally deleted my dad's voice from our answering machine. And she realized that she would never hear his voice again. I understand it. I get it. Why we want to know, why we want to chase these things. I understand why it is that people want to contact the dead that they've lost. It doesn't seem at the end of the day that it's particularly helpful, but I understand it. Death hurts. And this whole deal of seance in American culture, this whole reaching into the dead was actually brought to life and made its way into our culture by a couple of huckster sisters, of all things, in the state of New York. They had moved into a house, they were the Fox sisters, right outside of New York City, near Newark, New Jersey. And they moved into this house, and everyone in the neighborhood said that the house they moved into was haunted. And it was particularly haunted, they said, because someone was murdered in that house. And the person who was murdered in that house haunted that house. Again, you start lining up the stories about ghosts. The ghost wants to be remembered and seen, right? And so the girls observed that their parents were really freaked out about every noise that their house made. And they were really nervous that the stories of the ghost that haunted their house were true. So every time the house creaked, their parents freaked out, wondering if there was a ghost in their house. And so the girls started playing with their parents. This is like truly terrible stuff. Now, I get the appeal as a child, but man, they really went all in. They started by when their parents, the Fox sisters, now they're like 14 and 10 at this time. They're not 25 and 21. They're still pretty young. When their parents would start getting nervous about a sound in their house. Now, if you own a house, houses make noises, man. Like, you could convince yourself of anything, but if their house would start making noises, the girls would quietly pick up an apple and drop it behind their parents. There'd be an apple there. And then they took it to the next level, still with the apples. They would go to bed at night and they would take a string and they would tie it around an apple in their room. And when their parents were tucking them in and starting to leave, they would pull the string and the apple would start moving across the room. And their parents got more and more freaked out, more and more sure that their house was haunted. And so the girls decided that they could convince people that they had contact with the dead. And so they began doing that. They realized they had this other particular skill with their body and that they could crack their toes loudly on command. Okay? And so they would get people enraptured in a room and they would say they were going to call upon the dead that they were looking for. And the girls would begin to crack their toenails and their noise would fill the room in the dead silence. And they would say that that rapping noise was the spiritual realm coming into the room. And people bought this. And they didn't just like kind of buy it. Rich, wealthy, famous people of the day began funding them to move around the country. And more rich and wealthy people would come and pay them. They made a cottage industry, a financial gain of selling their wild charade to people who were grieving. And it wasn't just some people, like people you've heard of got in contact with these Fox sisters. James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohegans, was a true believer. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, all the way in London heard about them and met with them. The two sisters, by the time they died, had both publicly recanted, saying that none of it was true. They had no contact with the dead. It was an easy sell and an easy charade to people who were grieving and desperate. And they made a lot of money on people who were desperate. Both girls actually ended up dying alone and destitute. They paid a heavy price for their charade. But the people of that day in the 1800s were desperate to hear just one more time, to know that their beloved one was still okay and near and all right. This is often the space that grief and death can put us in. It makes us susceptible. It makes us desperate. And I want to tell you this today, that's okay. It's okay that grief hurts. It's okay that we're not always on guard or up to it when we're grieving. It's okay that death is hard to process and we don't always know when the pain's going to come. There's nothing about having to grieve or having grieved or having someone you love die 50 years ago that doesn't make it okay for it to hurt today. Grief is okay. And I want to wrestle with it just a little bit today. I want to look at how Jesus dealt with grief. I want to redeem grief a little bit because I truly and honestly think that us Christian folk don't do a great job with grief. And because we don't do a great job with grief, we really struggle to find healing. And so it seems important to me today to look at how Jesus dealt with grief as a way to instruct how we can deal with grief. And so we're going to look at John chapter 11 in just one moment. Starting with verse 17 if you want to look and find it. But just as an example about how we struggle with grief, I went to 2 funerals this week. One funeral I presided over, and the other funeral I attended. And I heard so many people in really, really difficult spaces, hurting, telling each other things that to me, from a distant point of view, sounded like they were encouraging them to move past it or to accept this death as good. Like, they have died, and they're in a better place now, so let's be happy for them. Okay, I mean, I understand why we would say that, but the funeral here is, we're here because we're sad, right? So how do we deal with that? There are a lot of times I'll go to a funeral and the language that everyone wants to use, this is really in vogue today, is to say, this is not a funeral, this is a celebration of life. And listen, I get that, because we should celebrate people's lives in funerals. Like, that's a great thing to celebrate life, right? But even the language is pretty quickly moving us away from the fact that we're sad to saying, hey, let's make this a happy occasion instead. And I get it. I get why we want to do that. But why is it that we as Christian people who have a hope in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection in the world that is to come in a heavenly realm where we'll spend eternally, why is it that we jump to that so fast as a way to seemingly skip past the fact that it hurts, that we're struggling? It doesn't seem to be disingenuous to me for us to spend some time mourning, even though we know that God will make all things right. And it seems to me like we would be a healthier people if we were honest about both of those things and work together in our time of grief. And I want to show you today in the story of Jesus, a famous story of Lazarus and his resurrection and the sisters that Jesus meets, that Jesus, who knows all things, knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the grave, knows that all things will be made new, has seen heaven firsthand. Even Jesus spends time in grief. And that seems really important to me as I read this text. And so I'm going to read to you from John chapter 11, verses 17 to 37. And I'd like to invite you, if you would, to stand with me as we read the word of the Lord today. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, I know he will rise. He'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die." "Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who has come into the world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. There are two types of accusations that Jesus takes in this text. Two very distinct, different accusations. And when we talk about grief, a lot of times we make an expectation that if we've grieved before, that people around us will grieve similarly. But this is really important to know that these two sisters who grew up in the same home have lost the same person and are grieving very differently from one another. I can tell you from testimony that my sister and I lost the same father, having grown up in the same house. And we grieve and process still to this day differently, having lost them. Grief is a difficult sort of thing to work through, and it's not the same from person to person in our own lives. We have different feelings, and these sisters have two very different frames of reference for grief here. And so they grieve to Jesus in very different ways, and Jesus answers them in very different ways. The first who will come to Jesus is Martha. Martha comes to Jesus, and she is stoic. She is theological. She is confessing her belief. She is sad. She wishes Jesus was there. She thinks that if Jesus had been in town when Lazarus had come ill, that he could have been healed. But she's understanding that not everything breaks your way all the time. She wishes it had been different, but she's wanting to keep her belief in order to give herself a sanity in this moment. She also, I think, probably wants to show Jesus that she's heard the teachings and that she's been prepared for this moment of death, that Jesus is indeed the one who will rise him again one day, that she will see him again, that in him there is no finality in death. But she is hurting and she's processing with Jesus at this moment. She wants to accuse him, but she's struggling to do it firmly. And Jesus says some of the most famous words that Jesus ever says. When Martha confesses that he is the Messiah, the Christ, when Martha confesses that she believes that Lazarus will live again one day, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life." This is an important text in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John assumes that the readers of the text are well versed in Jewish history. And those who know their Jewish history know that the moment that God acted in most power on favor for the Jews was when he entered into Egypt and freed them from slavery and led them to the promised land where they lived now. This was the miracle that defined them as a people. And that miracle started when a bush was burning in the desert and started speaking to Moses. And Moses is hearing this articulation of a vision of freedom, of new, of defeating the most powerful thing in this world. And Moses is wanting to believe it. Moses is wanting to say, yes, those people deserve to be freed. They should not be slaves. Yes, 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 but how am I going to convince Pharaoh? Who am I going to tell the Pharaoh has sent me to demand that they be freed? And the voice says, tell them I am sent you. I am. That is the name that God gives himself as he invites Moses into this calling of freeing people from bondage. I am. And the Gospel at John is very careful with this. He's not writing a very simple English subject, verb, predicate sentence. Over and over and over, Jesus says things like, I am the bread of life in the Gospel of John. Here, there's 7 times this happens. Here, I am the resurrection and the life. He's not saying to Martha simply, hey, I got this. He is saying in the midst of your grief, yearning for something more, in your theological categories that you're working through, I am is in your presence. God has shown up as you grieve. And God has shown up in a way that's working on 2 very different planes and not just one. I am the resurrection. That which has died will be given new life because God has shown up. And not just will be given, but I am the life. The life that is lived now is a gift as well. That which is here and now is a gift, and that which is to come is a gift. And the presence of God has come and given it to Martha, even when death feels like it's winning. She doesn't know what's coming, but God shows up when she's grieving. Something about this spurs her to go and grab her sister, who's not doing quite as well as her. She goes back and tells Mary that the teacher is here. And Mary is surrounded. The funeral has happened. The burial has happened. It's been 4 days. And they're sitting in a process of mourning. I'll talk about this here in just a minute, a little more in detail. But chances are these mourners weren't just friends, but people who were hired to come. And in Jewish culture, that was a job, to be a mourner. And so they were being paid that when the family wailed, they wailed. And when the family was silent, they were silent. And whatever it was they were expressing, the mourners wrapped around them and matched them in their hysteria or their sadness, their anger or their joy. And this was to be affirming, that the group would come around them and say, what you are feeling is normal, and we want to join you in your struggle. Mary is crying, she is weeping, and she comes out to Jesus with a little more fire in her step. Martha is rationalizing all that has happened. Mary comes there almost like poking him in the chest, falling on the ground, crying hysterically, and says, hey man, if you had been here, Lazarus had been alive. She's hysterical. She's more accusatory. She's more angry. She's more sad. Emotions have gripped her far more than they have Martha in this story. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus sees her in this space, weeping, in pain, hurting. He looks around and he sees people everywhere weeping. He sees them struggling. They're crying. He says, where have you laid him? And they said, well, bring you there. And Jesus in this moment, Jesus is asking where Lazarus is because he knows he's going to go there and call Lazarus out from the grave. Jesus could just say to the people who are mourning, just wait a minute, the good stuff is about to come. Wipe your tears. But he doesn't. In what we call the shortest verse in the Bible, there is such power packed in that sentence. He looks upon the people mourning, crying, emotional, and he joins them in that space. He does not try to wipe away the pain and say, listen, something good's coming, just wait, okay? He cries with them. The I am who promises big things also joins us in our pain. And the Jesus who did this with Mary and Martha in this story is still available to do just the same thing today. When you hurt and when you grieve, Jesus is not in heaven partying it up with all of your forefathers, saying, what are you so sad about? It's going to be great when you get up here. Jesus, in a very human way, in a very earthy, normal, you and me kind of a way here, sees pain and feels pain. He hurts out of empathy for his children who hurt. He doesn't try to wipe it away. He spends time grieving with his friends who are grieving. That strikes me as deeply powerful to remember that today. Because we as Christian folks do not grieve very well. We do not grieve very well at all. At funerals, we're always trying to say things to the people who are grieving to try to get them past their grief. I suspect that the psychological reason is because we're uncomfortable with people being uncomfortable around us. And so maybe if we say just the right thing, we can lighten the moment and make it all better so that we don't have to feel so uncomfortable. There's a list that gets passed around a lot of suggestions of things not to say at a funeral or to someone while they're in grief. It's curated by funeral directors. It's curated by people who work in the graveyard, by pastors who oversee funerals. These are the kind of things that people will often say to each other that are profoundly unhelpful. I think it's a list of 10 things for you. At least she lived a long life. Many people die young. That's not a helpful thing to say. He's in a better place now. Maybe so, but I'm right here. She brought this on herself. There's a reason for everything. You'll get over him. You can still have another child. She was such a good person. God wanted her to be with him. Or other variations like God needed another angel in heaven, another flower in his garden, or another soprano in his choir. I know how you feel. No, you don't. In fact, just the story we read today is two sisters feeling two very different things. She did what she came here to do, and it was her time to go. Or simply, be strong. These sort of things don't at all invite us to spend any time in the grief of the person that we've come to support. It doesn't affirm the grief. It doesn't affirm the hurt. It invites them to look past the fact that someone has been taken from them. So what are some things that you could say that would be more helpful moving forward? I'm not immune to this list. I've said some of those dumb things before. You try to fix it. This is what we do. We want to be fixers. We want to be helpers. But we don't do grief real well, and so things like that roll out of our mouth. Instead, we should be more apt to say things like, "This stinks," or maybe even choose a more colorful word when you're speaking to someone. You can say, "This is unfair." You could say, "I love you and I'm here for you. I'm up early or I'm to bed late, and here is my number if you ever need me." You could say, "I can't imagine how you feel, but I am willing to listen to how you feel if you ever need a friend." You can hug them rather than saying anything. And you can let them determine what the length of the hug is. These are all ways that are actually helpful for people who are in mourning. They're actual ways of naming the grief and the hurt that they feel and showing that you recognize it and that you stand behind them and with them as they struggle. So how is it that we as a Christian people with a tangible and real hope in a future that is glorious and eternal, how is it that we can grieve better, even follow the pattern of Jesus here and grieve better? I mean, it's interesting that our faith comes from the story of the Jewish people, and they're like rock stars at grieving. They know what they're doing. They have a plan. I have a whole worship book of the Jewish people in my office this week that I've been reading. And there's an entire section, not on how to conduct a funeral, but on the grieving process after having lost someone. It's really fascinating because the book I have just has words to say at a funeral. This book has a plan, a 12-month, 5-step plan when you lose someone, how to help rehabilitate yourself in roughly 12 months so that you haven't forgotten, but that you have spent a season of your life sitting and struggling in the grief of having lost someone that you've loved. And the most famous part of that 12-month process is called sitting Shiva. Have you heard of this before? Some of you heard it? Okay. Sitting Shiva, this is what the Jews do. This is a great practice. And listen, I got to be honest, I'm kind of glad I'm not Jewish, so I don't have to do it because it sounds awful, but it's also amazing and excellent. When you lose someone in your family as a Jew, you call together everyone who has loved this person and you invite them and the family, and you sit together for a week in the house of the one who is lost, and you process your grief. You tell stories. You take off of work. You remember them. You laugh about the things that they did. You cry together. But you intentionally, for 1 week of your life, look in the eyes of the people that you love or don't love so much, and you face the story of what has happened in your life. And you do so with a rabbi present so that there's a spiritual element. There are guided words to say and prayers to say over the period. But when someone near you or in your family dies, you take a week of your life to sit in the grief with the rest of the people affected. Now, take that and weigh that against how we Christians often do it. We hope the preacher isn't boring. We go looking for our black suit or our dark dress. We ask off for about a half hour before and after the funeral so that we don't have to take too much time off. We go to the funeral. We say a few platitudes to the people who are most affected. We squeeze out the back door. We go back to work. Most of our language coming from both pastors and people alike, especially if as a believer, is just to say how this is good actually. What? No, it's not. It's not. But how often do preachers, I'm throwing myself under the bus here, how often do preachers get up there and say, they're in a better place now? This is what we're hoping for. This is our yearning. They're now with Jesus. How happy and rapturous they must be. Well, okay, I get it, and I don't want to act like the point isn't for us to eventually be with Jesus. That's the point, right? But in the moment, the room is filled with people who are grieving, and the message we're giving is, this is okay because now they're better off. One of the real in vogue things that are happening these days is that people are saying they don't want to have a funeral. They want to have a celebration of life. And I get that inclination as well. I understand it. The people that we love, we want to celebrate all the things that they've done, and we want to have joy. We don't want to feel icky and bad. But we're struggling so much on the back end because we're doing so little to be honest about how much death hurts. And let's be honest about how death is talked about in the Scripture as well. Never once can you find a place in Scripture that says, hey guys, death will be the best thing that happens to you because then you go to heaven. That's not written in the Scriptures anywhere. What is written in the Scripture is the wages of sin is death. Death is the enemy to be conquered. Death is what Jesus defeated. Death is not good. And us talking about it as if it frees us from this life doesn't really work. Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. Not the resurrection and the death so you get to the resurrection part. Jesus is present in it all. And if you go back to the very beginning of the Scriptures, God did not intend death. This was not part of the creation process. God created life. And sin unwound the good creation of God and led to death. Death has been the battle that God has been waging since the tree in Adam and Eve's story. God is working to defeat death, not to embrace it as a way for us to get out of here. And so why do we try to help each other grieve by talking about death as if it's a good thing? This is the enemy that hell has thrown at us. And our hope is that one day the work of Jesus will defeat death finally. Death is the enemy. It's not a friend. And we know this because, well, we just said something about Genesis chapter 1. The end of the Scripture in Revelation is images of redoing Eden. There's garden imagery there. There's new imagery there. And again, the final work of defeating death is done. In Revelation chapter 21 are these words, and I'm just going to read this quickly to you as a reminder of what is to come. John has seen heaven, and he's writing down all that he saw. And one of the final scenes that he sees is this. Then I, John, saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now with the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new. Then he said, write this down. These words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. Death is the enemy. Death is what God is working to defeat. And when God, in the form of Jesus or as the Father, comes in contact with death, he goes to the mourners and he addresses their tears. He wipes them off their face and says, I will bring order to this. He sees them crying and he cries with them and offers them a better future. We should not skip past our grief. We should not expect our friends and family to skip past their grief. The work of grief is hard and it's painful. Our memories are long and healing is difficult. But we would do really, really well to practice our grief, to spend some time in our grief, to sit with our grief, to be honest about our pain, and recognize that we will be healed, and that in Christ we are being healed. But that Jesus didn't ask his own friends to move past their grief, but he joined them in the midst of their pain, crying right alongside of them. If you're grieving today, your church is here for you. If there's hurt in your life, if you can't get past a death that's 50 years old or one that's 2 months old, it's okay. Death is the enemy. Death is the worst thing that sin has created. And it hurts, and it's hard. And one day we will be healed. One day all things will be made new. One day we will see the face of the Alpha and Omega, and we will be well then. But in the meantime, we still fight a battle and wage war against that which sin causes. And we do so together by loving one another, grieving with one another, making space, having friendship with one another, being available, having a listening ear. Let us be the kind of people that learn to face the scars of death with honesty, with transparency, with telling stories and being present for one another, making it a priority that we announce and listen and share. We've all been touched by death, and then it's not brought us any joy. And so I thought today, as a way to take a moment and sit in our grief and practice our grief, instead of just saying, this is what it is, but how can we actually respond and move and do something? And I researched a lot of options and I looked through a lot of things and finally decided a neat way to do this would be to tie it to our local benevolence offering. Doing something that takes the memories of the ones who did things that we loved and passing on the gift of their good memory of loving the world on. So last week we were supposed to take our local benevolence offering and I forgot to. That's a typical thing. And so it kind of worked out though, because what I think we're going to do, if it's all right with you, is to take the memories of those who are floating around in our head right now, the people we've loved, the people we've given our life to, the people we've spent time with, the people who have loved us and meant the world to us. And we're going to practice their memory intentionally by telling their story. On both sides of me, on the black tables, there are index cards in a box. And tied to our local benevolence offering, if you would, is that I would like you to write their name down on the card. And if you are willing to give, even if just a little bit or a lot or nothing at all, that you would go and put their name on the card and put it in the box. And next week in our bulletin, we're going to put an insert in there that is in memory of those who were remembered today. And we'll announce how much we gave away to the Baltimore Rescue Mission, to a people who may not feel as though they would be grieved if they died, who feel like they're forgotten. We're going to pass on the memory of the ones we've loved in giving in their memory to the rescue mission as they head towards planning for Christmas and the winter. This is the time of the year where they're desperate for money to help clothe those who are needy and help show acts of love to people who are lonely. And so by taking the memories and the joys of ours in the past, I'm hoping that standing and writing their name down and giving a gift in their memories, which will let the rescue mission know is in memory of your loved one, no matter how much or little you give. We'll give them that list and then name that list next week. And I'm hoping that something tangible about giving on, passing on, handing on something good to a people in need will be just another way that we could name the memory of the good people that we've loved in our lives and pass on their memory in positive ways and let you know that your church remembers with you and grieves with you and cares with you. So as we sing this final song, I'm going to invite you to stand. If you'd like to come and name one who you grieve over or have grieved over, if you'd like to give a donation that we'll give away to the rescue mission, you could do that. If you'd like to do both, we would appreciate it. But come and spend some time remembering and passing on the memory of that who you grieve to your church. Let's sing together.